Hello, everyone. Welcome back to
Lee, and
Ahmed's Weekly.
where we investigate and analyze a new case every week. So, Ryan, today we were thinking about talking about the case B versus Children's Aid Society of Metropolitan Toronto.
Yep,
So, this was a very important landmark case. This case set a lot of precedents and just a lot of important legal implications for like the Canadian legal system. I think this was definitely a very important case, and just in terms of like how religious freedoms and religious beliefs, might interact with the Canadian medical system and the idea of medical consent. So, Ryan, do you want to just kind of start us off, give an agenda of kind of what we're going to go over in this episode today?
of course. So, on today's episode, we'll be covering the details of the case. We'll be bringing in the Oakes test and how it relates to this case. We'll also be sharing our personal opinions on the matter,
All right.
and we'll be talking about the implications of the court rulings.
Okay, awesome. So, Ryan, how about you start us off by explaining at least a bit of the case background here?
Right. So, back in 1983, the Children's Aid Society of Metropolitan Toronto was granted wardship over the appellant's newborn infant. And
Okay.
this had happened because the newborn required a blood transfusion, right? But
Yeah.
catch this, the parents refused to provide consent for this transfusion due to their religious beliefs.
Really? So, what were these religious beliefs that kind of like prohibited them from this like necessary procedure?
Good question. So the parents were Jehovah's Witnesses, right?
Mm,
And to my understanding, due to their religious beliefs, they cannot partake in blood transfusions.
all
So
right.
that's why they refused that.
Okay, and just like after they found out about this worship order, right? Like, what was the response of the parents? Do you mind explaining that?
Right. So the parents actually appealed the wardship order, but the court dismissed the appeal because, well, one, the transfusion had already happened, and two, the Child Welfare Act that we mentioned had actually been replaced by the Child and Family Services Act.
All right. So, what was kind of like the basis of their argument?
Good question. So the appellants argue that family autonomy is guaranteed in the seventh section of the charter, right?
Hmm.
And that section includes their freedom to make healthcare decisions for their children.
All right, I see how that. I definitely see how that connects for sure.
Yeah, yeah. And another thing, this case was actually brought up before the SEC, which stands for
The Supreme Court of Canada. All right. So,
right. Floor is yours.
all right. So basically, the Supreme Court of Canada, once this case got to them, they ruled that when parental failings result in the compromise of a child's health, their security, and their well being, the government, representing the community, is allowed to replace the duties of these guardians and parents in a legal concept called parens patriae.
Parents, patrie. That sounds pretty important. How do you spell
Indeed,
that?
so this is spelled Parens, then second word Patriae. This is a
Huh.
very important concept for this case, and honestly, a lot of other cases involving minors and people that are somewhat, I suppose you'd say, people who are at risk or disadvantaged. But oftentimes, when someone is under the care of a guardian and they're not being properly taken care of, they can be taken under the wing of the government, and the government can step in and take over these duties, especially, let's say, they need like a medical procedure, which they aren't able to get. The government can step in and help them and help provide for them through ensuring that they are given access to these procedures. So we can see through this concept, this legal concept, that the common law of Canada often and generally places a greater emphasis on a child's right to life over the parents' religious beliefs or the religious objections to treatment of this kind. So, furthermore, we can see in this case the SEC ruled that the circumstances of this case were all properly in accordance with the principles of fundamental justice, and that there were no judicial biases or misconduct in this case and in the rulings. This is due to the fact that the appealants were making the case that perhaps there was some sort of unfairness in the trial and in the courtroom. Sorry. So we can see that despite these appealants, they're saying that the Child Welfare Act is unfair and preventing them from practicing their religion and infringing on their guaranteed right to the freedom of religion in Section 2, subsection A of the Charter. Sorry. We can see that the SEC already just flat out disagrees with this stance. Um, Ryan and I were talking about this earlier during our research, but it mentions how there was a important landmark case called the RV Big M drug mart case, which is where the SEC essentially struck down the Lord's Day Act, which was an act which ensured that businesses and restaurants and such could not operate on Sundays. So the SEC, through this case, they shut that down. They struck down that act, and they pointed out that religious freedom was subject to the necessary limitations as long as it protects public safety, order, health, morals, or the fundamental rights and freedoms of the citizens of Canada. So, Ryan, do you mind explaining just kind of how this might tie into our case?
Of course. So if we're looking at the target of the Child Welfare Act, it is the preservation of life, right? And that concept is fundamental to the Canadian legal system.
Absolutely.
All right. So that would lead us to the
Next
next segment
segment.
of our
Yes,
episode, right?
indeed.
Yes, yes, yes.
So this is a bit of a surprise segment for especially our longtime listeners, longtime viewers.
Yeah.
But I'm sure all of you have seen that recently a certain topic has become very hotly debated. We are a little bit slow to kind of catch up on this topic, but I'm sure you listeners have definitely heard of it by now. But AI, right? We've heard all of this stuff about how AI is kind of taking over the world, how some people even believe it might take over lawyers. Whether or not that's true, we'll see. I'm still a bit skeptical, but still a lot of time left. But Ryan, do you mind explaining how we used AI for this episode?
Yeah, yeah. So we used AI to fact check the information or the details of this case, right?
Hmm.
So we plugged in some questions to AI, and what it spat back out at us was its attempt at giving us the case details. And to our surprise, it actually got most of it correct. Just
Yeah,
one piece of information wrong, which we'll cover in a second, but most of the information was correct.
yeah, just like Ryan's saying, right? When we put the stuff into AI, we were kind of just asking about the case, trying to get details about it, expecting it to probably trip up somewhere. But surprisingly, it actually managed to get most of this right. It through all of our prompts, right? It mainly was able to get these details right. It only fumbled on one specific part, which was when we asked about the key points which the Supreme Court based its ruling on in this case. It mentioned the capacity to consent and said that the court assessed the child's maturity and understanding, which we can obviously see was not an important part of this case, considering the child would have been a newborn infant. So obviously, it naturally cannot understand this case, and it would have no maturity necessary to be capable of these medical decisions, right, and capable of consenting. So, Ryan, do you want to just kind of explain like why the AI might have messed this up, why it might have gotten this part wrong when it seemingly got everything else correct?
Right. That's a good question. Um, to be honest, well, just for me, if I'm thinking about it,
Yeah.
when we're asking the AI this question about this case, involving medical consent, children,
Hmm.
maybe it might have been thinking about other cases, because when you do think about other cases that involve children and consent, the capacity to consent, like involving that child, does come up a lot.
Mm.
It's a
Yeah.
common
Yeah.
theme or issue that comes up. So maybe the AI model got confused and it threw that bit of information in there. Um, and in relation to this case, it was incorrect.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point about just kind of like how AI is just drawing from like this huge wealth of information, right? So oftentimes I think it is definitely pretty likely that it might be is pulling a bit too much information from one thing that's unrelated, but the AI thinks could be related and just throwing stuff out there. But
Yeah.
yeah, I think that's a great point, Ryan.
All right. Thank
And
you,
I
Vinny.
think let's transition to our next segment, right?
The Oakes test. Well, the Oakes test is basically when you think about the law, when the law says it's gonna limit a right, like let's say the freedom of expression,
Okay.
it has to pass this test, the Oakes test, to show that the limitation is fair and reasonable, right?
Okay. Could you just talk about what are the criteria of this Oaks test, right?
Okay, so there are four questions. Let's start with the first one. Was there a pressing and substantial objective? Well, Vinny, what does that mean?
All right. So when this is applied to a law or applied to a measure, what this is saying is that the law or measure or act should be aiming to achieve a significant public goal with urgency. So the pressing part is obviously referring to the urgency of this, I suppose, this issue. So we can see potentially certain ways which an issue might be urgent and might be immediate. And then the substantial part is simply referring to the importance of this issue and referring to the importance of the objective, just how much need do we have for addressing this objective. So Ryan, do you want to explain just kind of how how this applies to our case and just maybe just give a brief refresher on just the specific freedoms and rights that were infringed upon that necessitated the use of the Oakes test, since I'm sure the listeners might have forgotten by now.
Okay, so simply put, in this case, the objective was to protect the health and safety of this child, right?
Right.
And that you mentioned, the rights and freedoms that were being infringed. You take a look at Section 2, subsection A, under
Yeah.
fundamental freedoms of the Charter. It talks about the freedom of religion, right? So that was being infringed. And then if you look at Section 7 in legal rights of the Charter, it talks about the right to life, liberty, and security of the person, right?
Yeah.
Well, that's that. And if we look at the next question of the Oakes test, would you
Right.
like to?
So yeah, I'll take it from here, Ryan. So the second Oakes test question was essentially if the objective is rationally connected to the measure or act set out by this law. So Ryan, do you kind of just want to explain what that might mean more specifically?
Right. So for this question, it's basically trying to say that the court has to see if the restriction actually makes sense in achieving their goal.
Right.
So would you like to explain how this question relates to our case?
Right. So essentially what it's putting out is that in this case, the provisions of the Child Welfare Act are fundamentally related to its objectives. For example, the concept of parents patriae. Under emergency circumstances, the state must quickly obtain this authority that normally belongs to, for example, parents and guardians. So we can see that the effect in the law is rationally connected to its objective, since the objective of this law, as said earlier, is to protect the child's health and life. If needed, they need to ensure that they have a way of ensuring this objective is properly carried out. And another question I saw earlier, I just wanted to bring it up really quick, was if the infringement is justified under Section 1 of the Charter. So we can see that it is justified since Section 1 clearly states that the rights and freedoms set on the Charter are guaranteed only to reasonable limits prescribed by law. So we can see that here the reasonable limits are being placed on the parents' rights in the sense that their rights to expressing their religious freedom is being limited so that the law can save the lives of children.
All right, of
Now, that brings us to our next Oakes test question. If you want to take the wheel, Ryan.
course. So this next question is asking if, well, it's about if it minimally impaired the rights or freedoms.
Right.
Now,
So,
yeah,
if you want, I could take the wheel from here, just explain what this is before passing it back.
please do.
All right. So, essentially what this is saying is the measure needs to only impair the right as little as it possibly can in order to achieve the objective that's set out by it. So in this case, it would be what Ryan is about to explain further, but essentially just ensuring that the infringement of the sections of the charter in this set like law are not done in such a way that they are gross and just like negligent, and just ensuring that people are able to do whatever they like in full negligence of what the charter is saying. So Ryan, do you want to kind of expand on that and just explain how it impairs the rights or freedoms?
Right. So in this case, the blood transfusion for the child, that was necessary, right? To
Hmm.
save that child's life, or to protect them from harm. So in this case, the government had to take a parent's role, like you mentioned earlier, the whole idea of parents patriae. The
Yeah.
government had to step in into that role and ensure that the child received the blood transfusion. Now, the government didn't actually withdraw any other rights from the parents. They only just took that role temporarily during that
Mhm.
process, to make sure the child received the transfusion.
All right. And I just wanted to kind of, just before we move on to the next Oaks question, I just want to kind of explain why this blood transfusion might be so important, just because I'm sure
Right.
some people don't have the background on the case, and we didn't really cover it.
Good
But
point.
essentially, the necessary part of this transfusion was that it was an examination just to ensure that there was no glaucoma present in the child, which is essentially a condition which could lead to your optic nerve being damaged and resulting in often blindness or loss of vision. So we can obviously see that this was a very important operation, since they suspected that this child might be at risk of having a disability that would severely affect the rest of their life.
Yeah, there was good reason.
Yeah. So
Okay.
let's move to the last OSES question, right?
Right.
This question is, was the measure proportional? It's about the proportionality of the measure. So Ryan, could you just explain really quickly what this means?
Of course. So this question is where they figure out if the way that they're limiting the right is appropriate, compared to the goal that they're trying to achieve. Would you like to explain how that relates to our case?
All right. Yeah. So really, when you think of law, right, you're thinking of often one of the main symbols of it, the scales. So this section of the Oakes test is essentially putting the effect of the law on one side and then putting its objectives on the other, and just weighing the importance of this objective against the effects. So we can see in this case that the affected parents and the guardians of the law who are affected by this are really only those who are neglecting or refusing to provide the medical care that their child needs. And as such, it doesn't really overly restrict or limit the objective, and it doesn't really provide any reason not to truly, I suppose, go for this objective and ensure that it's being carried out, because it's still tackling a very important objective, and the limits that it's imposing, the law itself, the measures, they aren't really overly limiting, and they're not overly restrictive of a certain demographic. And as such, they're remaining proportional to the goals and the interests of this legal decision.
All right.
So yeah, and that's pretty much how it connects to this case. There were some who were arguing that the parents' right to follow their religion should be respected, even in cases where it risks the child's health. Others were saying the state's involvement might harm the relationship between these religious communities, like Jehovah's Witnesses, and the healthcare legal system. So you can obviously see that there are a lot of perspectives to this, but the Supreme Court was very firm on their decision that this, while it does infringe on a charter right, did so in a justified way and fully fulfilled the Oakes test criteria. So,
Nice.
Ryan, do you want to bring us to our next segment?
All right. So now we'll be going on to our opinions on the case.
All right.
So I guess I'll start.
All right. If you'd like, I'll just ask you. So, Ryan, do you believe that the case ruling here was correct or fair? Do you think that it was done in such a way that it was really like properly analyzing the case and the circumstances?
Hmm. Well, personally, I do think that the court's decision was fair. This case really revolved around, again, the concept of parens patriae, the idea that the government can step in when a child's well-being is put at serious risk, right?
Yeah.
Here, the court prioritized that child's right to life over the parents' religious beliefs, right?
Yes.
And even when it came to the Oakes test, uh, the Child Welfare Act had a clear goal in mind to protect the child's health, right? And
Okay.
ordering that blood transfusion was basically the only way to do that here. But Vinny, what's your take? I mean, do you think they found the right balance here?
Yeah, I mean, I think you really brought up a lot of good points. Like, I feel like a lot of my argument was really taken off through yours, right? So, I think for the most part, I do personally think the decision was fair. I think they had a lot of legal reasons, right? They called back to precedent from before with RV Big M Drug Mart. They called back to a lot of other like legal concepts, like you said earlier, parents patriae.
Hmm.
But I do think maybe through their analysis of the Oakes test questions, I think maybe some of it could have been fleshed out a bit better. For
Okay.
example, when they were talking about minimal impairment, and I was reading through this, I noticed that they were essentially just saying it's hard to think of or devise a different way to ensure this treatment is done that is less restrictive. But I really do feel like it kind of hand waves this idea. I'm not saying they're necessarily wrong, but I do feel like maybe they could have analyzed it more, and maybe they did, and they just that was the wording they chose. But
Mhm.
in my eyes, I think maybe they could have done a bit more with that one.
Okay, that's fair.
Yeah, and so I was just wondering, Ryan, since we're talking about this, what do you think the implications of the case were? How did it affect legal precedent, right? Since this was a landmark case, so it was very important.
True. It's a good question. Well, this case did set a strong example for how courts can handle similar issues in other cases, right?
Right.
Basically, it showed that if a child's life is on the line, the government can step in, right?
Hmm.
Even if it goes against the parents' wishes or beliefs.
Absolutely.
So, even moving forward, right, this decision will give courts a solid basis to protect the child's health and safety in tough cases like this one right here.
Okay.
So, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I agree, right? Like, this case has a lot of implications on, for example, like society, right? It has these religious moral implications that a lot of people probably are very strongly opinionated on. I think you are right about how it gives a lot of solid basis to these things, but I'm thinking more, even in just like the societal standpoint, there's a lot to be said about how the government here is showing how they are completely favoring how do I say this? The right to life of a child, for example,
Hmm.
over the religious and moral beliefs that someone might hold. And I think it's not necessarily wrong again, but I think it is something to consider just how this might affect like other parts of society, right? Like let's say other religions, their beliefs, how those might be restricted by similar thinking.
All right,
So I think that was a good discussion so far, Ryan. So I think we should just wrap it up for today, wrap it up for this episode, and let's just
let's do
recap
it.
what we went over.
Well, in today's episode, we covered the case details.
Hmm.
We uh, we brought up that twist on today's episode of the AI fact check.
Yeah.
We brought in the Oakes test and its relation to the case. And what else did we talk about, Benny?
And then we finally ended off with our opinions about the ruling and then the implications that this ruling might have had on our legal system, on our society, and just the general moral and religious implications. So,
That's
Ryan, do you want to end us off on just any final thoughts, any final takeaways just from these cases?
final takeaway. Well, it's cases like these that remind us how the law can step in, right, to
Yeah.
balance individual rights with the safety of others. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's an absolutely great point, right? It's interesting to me how these cases can be so deeply entrenched in like this legal precedent from all the way back with RV Big M Drug Mart, which is like a long, long time ago. I think that's what the 80s, 90s or so. So we can
Mhm.
see just how deeply entrenched these cases are with each other, how they shape how future laws are practiced and administered, in such a way that they're really self-referential, and these cases kind of are always fully evolving our legal system and ensuring that our legal system is necessarily improving and always making sure that we're finding new and more varied ways in order to, I suppose, inform our thinking and new ways to just truly understand why we feel the way we do about certain things.
Wow. I could not have said it better myself, Vinny.
Thanks. And just so you know, listeners, we're going to wrap it up here today. But thank you so much for listening. This has been Lee and.
Ahmed's Weekly.
Now, if you enjoyed the episode, please make sure to follow the podcast and tune in next week. We're going to be talking about another case just like today.
Yes, indeed. See y'all later.